Have you ever found yourself facing the infamous dilemma of having nothing to wear? Well, in my case, that scenario was reality. I realized that I possess only one short sleeve top, so I decided to make a cottagecore blouse. I started with a pattern and the help of my friend Clara to create the first mock-up on my new dress form, which by the way works much better than pinning it on myself. Once the major alterations were marked, I made the adjustments to the mock-up by sewing the pieces together anew and also adding some darts wherever I had to remove some fabric. Those shouldn't appear in the later pattern, but for now it made clear where the material has to be reduced and the pattern adjusted accordingly. Then I checked the new mock-up on my dress form. And since I figured that the main issues were solved, I measured the material missing on the two big back gores and marked it directly onto the fabric. Nonetheless, I was unsure if the dress form actually represents my body, since this is my first mock-up using it. I also tested it on my body just to be really sure. It was definitely not perfect yet, but the overall shape had gotten much better. So I decided to cut another mock-up based on these shapes, since the pattern had already gotten wonky. I cut along every vertical seam of the mock-up to get the new pattern pieces. And then checked if both sides match each other. In most instances this was the case, and where not, I decided to use the wider part so that I could take material away if it was actually too much. Only the back pieces caused me some more thinking, since I needed to add some material at the back hip. Therefore I had to move one part outwards. This was not the right solution, but I had to make the step to learn, I guess. I cut out the fabric based on the pattern pieces of the old mock-up, making sure to add seam allowance only where I would actually sew. Only for the hem I added some more so I could level it out to one height later in the process. I pinned the pieces together quickly and the sewing was done swiftly too. Once I tested the new mock-up on the dress form, the front seemed okay, but the back was just bad. The extra material I had added to accommodate my wider hips was now way too much and created those huge flaps. So I decided to divide the back piece into 3 pieces, removing the middle back seam and having 2 side back pieces. This way I could create the curve needed for my waist and hips without having too much material everywhere. This could probably have been solved in one piece too, but I couldn't figure out how. With those alterations, the mock-up was almost how I wanted it to look. I just took out some more material at the front waist. Unfortunately, I forgot to film the final version of the mock-up, but you will see it in the final blouse. Then I had to decide in which direction I wanted the diamond shapes of the pattern to face, and I settled on them facing upwards. With all the materials gathered, the sewing could start. I thought it would be smart to fold the fabric in half so that I could cut out the lining in the same step. It saved me some cutting time, but the diamonds didn't align well, despite me thinking that I had made sure they do. I don't recommend this approach for patterns where alignment matters. In this case, it wasn't that noticeable in the end result. I distributed the pattern pieces which I had transferred onto paper beforehand as effectively on the fabric as possible and started cutting them out. Only the sleeves wouldn't be lined, so I just cut them out twice, not 4 times like all the other pieces. This is my face when I realized that I hadn't thought about the yarn I would use, but white was definitely not the right choice. So I searched my yarn stash for something close enough. And I actually found a blue cotton thread I had left over from sewing my working skirt with the rose pattern. After preparing the bobbin, I adjusted the little tool to measure the seam allowance to 1 cm and started sewing the main bodice and the lining together. For every seam I secured the loose ends with 2 knots so that the seam stays put at the edges. Then I press the seams first to one side, then to the other, and finally open. The tailor Sam made it much easier to make these very round areas as flat as possible. Then I cut the seam allowance with a zigzag scissor to fade out the hard edges of the seam allowance. This would have been easier before ironing the seam allowance open, something I tried to remember for the future. The bodice was now finished, so I sewed the main fabric and lining of the shoulder straps together and then sewed it to the front side. This was not the smartest step, as sewing the sleeves on later was somewhat more difficult this way. Then I proceeded by sewing the bodice and lining together, having the shoulder straps sandwiched between them. In the future I would definitely sew the shoulder straps to the bodice and the lining separately, then sew them together in one big swoop. That would make things a lot easier. Once the upper bodice seam was closed, I cut a tiny triangle out of the seam allowance at the center back to accommodate the slight V-shape of the back, and I ironed the seam flat, making sure that the lining is slightly set to the back. Then I closed the front seams of the closure. And before I forgot about it, I cut triangles into the seam allowance at the seams going over the bust so that these seams lay as flat as possible. Since the sleeves are slightly puffy, I set the stitch lengths to the widest possible on this machine and sew 2 rows next to each other on the sleeve cap. Then I switched back to a normal stitch length and closed the arm side seams. It occurred to me that I might need something to finish the bottom of the sleeves, some sort of cuffs. Since I hadn't made a pattern piece, I cut a strip of fabric along the pattern and tested if it is actually tight enough around my arm and wide enough to pull over my wrist. Both requirements were met, so I proceeded by ironing the cuff in half, sewing the gathering threads with a wide stitch, gathering the sleeve into the cuff, and finally sewing the sleeves to one side of the cuffs. Once this little chaos was dealt with, the sleeves themselves had their turn. This was when I realized that I had made things way more difficult than necessary by sewing the straps already. But I couldn't be bothered with reopening the entire upper part, so I sewed around the points where I had messed up and would fix it later by hand. I started to sew the lining over the raw edges of the sleeves with a felling stitch. Once I came to the points where the straps are sewn to the bodice, I had to cut into the seam allowance to be able to fold it inside. This way I solved my mess, which is not perfect nor beautiful, but it worked. The back side of the cuffs I sewed in the same way. It was just much easier since I didn't have to fiddle around that much. The next day I trimmed the hem evenly and then folded the seam allowance to the inside, putting special effort into making the two pieces exactly the same length. Then I sewed the lining to the front fabric using a felling stitch. Just as I did with the upper seam, I made sure that the lining is slightly shorter than the main fabric so that it won't show on the front. After playing the difficult game of choosing the right buttons and on top of that the right amount of them, I settled on using some big mother of pearl buttons as I found they don't get lost in the pattern of the fabric. My modern machine took the task of sewing perfectly straight buttonholes upon itself. I had almost nothing to do apart from watching it do its work. After this break from sewing, I got back to it and sewed the buttons on. Making sure they are tightly secured by threading the end around the shank multiple times. Some of you suggested in the comments that I should use some pins at the end of the buttonhole when I cut them open. I must say, thank you. This is such a relief for my fearful mind, and this task wasn't put on hold at all. I just did it and the needle stopped the knife whenever I got close to the end. Finally, I removed any loose threads and those left visible from the gatherings. I put the blouse on my dress form to check if everything looks right and realized that I don't like how the sleeves are looking. The puffiness didn't come through as I had hoped, so I decided to add some puff pads to make them stand up a little more. I cut 4 half circles of fabric, sewed the straight sides together and then gathered the rounded sides. This way I created 2 tiny cushions which I then hand sewed to the shoulder straps, facing outwards into the sleeves. It's a bit unfortunate that summer has given way to cooler weather, leaving it waiting in the wardrobe for the next season. But come next summer, I'll be prepared with not 1, but 2 short sleeve tops that I can proudly call my own.